If I hadn't grasped, without a doubt, I would be dead. If I had kept my mouth shut, gone into the prison system, I would have died in prison. It's not that I think I would have died. I would have died. I would not be here now. I would be dead. They would have found some 18-year-old who wanted to earn half ounce of dope who would have stabbed me in the showers, mate. I've been in prison. I've been on remand. You upset someone, you may only end up with 50 stitches. You may end up a bit worse off than that.
It suddenly occurred to me that if I played my cards right, I might be able to find a way to get out of this situation I was in. There was no way I was ever going to go to the police and tell them about the murders, but if Mick and Jack just happened to get arrested or smuggling drugs, they'd be out of my hair for years. I needed to make sure there would be no comeback on me, but Jim was going on about how good he was at protecting his contacts. I still wanted to put it to the test though. After a few meetings, including one where Jim had invited me around to his house, I started to feel more comfortable with him. It was almost like he was a friend who just happened to work for the police rather than anything else. But he was never completely off duty. His priority was always getting information from me. Every now and again, he'd mention the name of some local tow rag and ask if I knew anything about what he was up to. Sometimes I told him, sometimes I didn't. It usually depended on how drunk I was. I was starting to trust him more and more, and basically confessed that during my drug smuggling days, which were long over, I'd been involved with a sizable load of duff cannabis, which I'd ended up chucking away. He got really excited, and we jumped into the car and drove over to the fishing lake at Sandpit Lane, and I pointed out where the drugs were. I was saying to him, "It's about 50 kilos of puff. I'm sure it would look blinding on your record that you've had this astounding find because of your initiative." And he was like, yeah. He was getting really excited. He said if the cannabis was really there, I'd get a reward. And if there was any information I had on other people, I'd get more rewards for that as well. I made it pretty clear there was plenty more I could say about other stuff going on, but he'd had to do his bit by making sure my name wasn't linked to the find in the lake. If he did that, then I'd lead him to some bigger fish. Not surprisingly, Jim got really excited and promised there would be no comeback. Within a day or two, he'd arranged for a diving team to go out and have a look at the place. I had to laugh when I saw the headlines of the local paper. To protect me, they announced that the Essex diving team were on a routine training mission at the lake, and they just happened to find all the cannabis. Jim also told me, as each and every bar was pulled out of the water, he wiped it down to ensure my fingerprints would never be found. The papers put the street value at something like 100,000, which was a bit mad considering it was all cack, and the reason we chucked it away was because we couldn't even give it away. When the news broke about the find, Mick was straight on the phone. I actually hadn't told him what I'd done with the cannabis. After all, he just told me to get rid of it. I don't think he cared, as long as he didn't have to look after it anymore. But he called up and said, "Is that ours? Did you dump it in the sandpit?" Mick was most worried about whether they'd find his fingerprints on the puff. I calmly told him not to worry, that I'd wiped down every bar before I chucked it in. "Great, nice one, Darren," he said, and then he was gone again. Jim seemed to be keeping up with his end of the bargain. I began to realise there was a pretty good chance of the rest of my plan working out. The very next day, Mick called me again and asked if I could pop round as he might have something for me. He was talking about drugs, of course. It was all going like clockwork. The future was looking rosy. When it came to collecting the reward, Jim told me I'd have to become a registered informant and meet his governor. If I wanted to stay anonymous, it would also mean coming up with a plausible story about how I knew the cannabis was in the lake. Jim suggested I say I'd overheard a conversation in a pub with a couple of dealers talk about having hidden some dope there. The final step was to come up with a code, one that didn't relate to any other villain or any other real person that either of us knew. It's not as easy as you think, and after what seemed like hours of stupid or useless suggestions, we settled on Ken Rugby, because Jim's son was in the school rugby team, and Ken was the name of his instructor. Using a false name was always a way of protecting me. Along with our cover story, it meant the top cop brass didn't need to know anything about me or my personal drug connections. I met Jim's governor in the car park of the Dolphin pub and told him about the made-up story. He said brilliant, and counted me out £400 in £10 notes. I signed for the money as Ken Rugby and waved goodbye as he left. As soon as he was out of sight, Jim held out his hand and said, "Bottle of scotch?" I paused for a second and counted him out £50 from the money I'd been given. It should have been another one of them times when warning bells were ringing in my head, but I just didn't see it. I mean, we spent ages making up this totally false story so that I could get the money in the first place. I wouldn't have got any of it without him, so sharing the wealth seemed a decent thing to do. I'd been teasing Jim somewhat rotten about the other stuff I knew, and he was so keen to find out about it that he started making all sorts of promises to get me on side. I'd mentioned to him I was really interested in getting a burger van in the area, because you can make some really good money from them. My bank had already agreed to give me the loan, but the hard part was getting the licence. Without it, you just get moved on every couple of hours and spend all your time paying fines. Jim said he had a friend at the council, and that if I helped him out, he'd make sure I got my licence. It was almost too good to be true. I was going to get rid of Mick and Jack. I wasn't going to get into trouble myself, and I was going to be able to set up my own business. There was no room for doubt. Meeting Jim had to be the best thing that had ever happened to me. It had happened more than 2 years earlier, but I still hadn't forgiven Alan Richards. It was one of those Christmas parties where everyone was drinking too much and I wasn't going to be left behind. But after a couple of hours, I started to feel really ill, decided to go home early. Maybe it was something I ate. Sandra was having a good time. Richards, who I knew fairly well because he used to go out with one of Sandra's sisters, said he'd drop her home for me. When the time came, Sandra got in Richard's car and off they went. Only he didn't take her to our place. He took her to his place, which was in the middle of nowhere. And once they got there, he started going on about how he was too drunk to drive and I should have to stay the night. She tried calling me, but I was too far gone to hear the phone, so she had to sleep, fully clothed, on his sofa. Richards tried it on a couple of times, but obviously didn't get anywhere. Even though nothing happened, Sandra knew I'd be really pissed off about the whole thing, and she was right. Although we'd been sort of friends, I didn't have a lot of time for Richards, even before the thing with Sandra. He worked as a car sprayer, and he used to hire someone to go out and put key scratches down the side of every nice car in his neighbourhood, just to generate business for himself. So I always thought he was a bit of a scumbag. I finally ran into him a couple of days later, and I wanted to tear his head off, but he started crying like a little baby, and saying, "Please don't hit me," and all that. His excuse for that night was a classic. He was so drunk that he forgot that she was in the car with him, and he'd just driven home. I walked away. Ever since then, whenever our paths have crossed, he would try to clear the air and offer to buy me endless drinks. Me, being the well-adjusted, sensible adult that I am, would mercilessly rip the piss out of him at every opportunity, winding him up and showing him up in front of everyone. Richards happened to be a friend of Jim. In fact, he was the man who'd borrowed the XR3i and written it off. On this particular night, Jim was in the pub, actually sitting next to Richards, while I took the piss out of him. Richards was getting more and more upset, not just because of what I was saying, but also because he considered Jim to be a really good friend of his. But rather than standing up for him, Jim was just giggling to himself. Richards finally had enough and stood up and said the two of us should go and talk outside. I was getting really into it by then, really enjoying the wind-up, so I pretended I misunderstood what he'd said. I was going, "Fucking great idea, you and me outside right now, come on in, let's go get it on." Richards was horrified and sat back down immediately, saying, "No, not like that." But as he sat down, his chair collapsed. He ended up rolling around on the floor. Everyone in the pub started laughing at this point, and Richards sulked off with some excuse about needing to use the toilet, while I started trying to put his chair back together. It was like a jigsaw puzzle, and I was bashing bits with my hand and all sorts, when the landlord saw me, came over and accused me of trying to smash the place up. He went mad. His first words were, "People like you," and then he started going on about how thugs were putting him out of business, and how important it was to respect people's property. I was on my feet straight away. "What do you mean, people like me?" I shouted back. The guy was a little fucker, and I was towering above him. I threw the bits of the chair back on the floor, and told him to poke it up his arse, because I hadn't done anything wrong. As I walked away, Jim and the others explained to the landlord what had happened, and he came running over to apologise, and promised me drinks on the house for the rest of the night. But I was still fuming, so I went out into the car park to calm down. Jim came out with me. We started chatting about various dealers around the town and how to catch them at it. He was telling me that I could trust him completely because nothing I said would ever be official unless I wanted it to be. So I basically told him Mick was a big-time drug smuggler. In an instant, Jim started to get really excited. He was saying, "You've got to get back in with him. Yeah. Get in with him." I was asking how. The only time he ever spoke to me was when I was buying drugs off him. Jim told me to buy drugs off him to find out when the next big shipment was coming in. "But what shall I do with the puff that I buy from Mick?" I asked him. "Sell it, of course." "Fair enough. In fact, if you let me know where you sell it to, I can go around and nick them." "That's a bit strong, innit? You're kidding, ain't ya?" There was a pause. We'd both been drinking heavily. I was a bit fuzzy-headed, but even then, it was obvious that it was completely serious. "Of course I am," he said at last. Somewhere in my head, alarm bells were ringing, but I was so swept up in the idea of Mick being arrested that I just ignored them. The thing is, I had no idea what it actually means to be an informant, how it actually works. On TV it seems to involve nothing but wearing a really bad shirt and hanging around in dodgy pubs and sitting next to cops in their cars and telling them the word on the street. The reality is probably very different, but Jim never sat me down and gave me a lesson or handed me over some police pamphlet of how to be a grass, so I just made it up as I went along. The unwritten rule so far as I saw it was that I was allowed to buy drugs from Mick, sell them on in the usual way, keep any profit that I made for myself, just so long as I always kept Jim informed about what I was doing. No problem. The idea of me stitching up my friends, proper friends that is, not people like Mick, just to make Jim look good, was really bothering me, right out of order. But then the conversation drifted off into some other area. I really can't remember what. By the time we went back inside, Richards had vanished. It didn't matter how many different ways he tried looking at it. The conclusion was always the same. Alan Richards had hardly got any sleep that night. Instead, he went over the events of the evening again and again in his mind. It started when Nicholls had started taking the piss out of him, and Jim hadn't said anything. This just wasn't fair. After all, Richards had given Jim information on the Essex criminal underworld for months now. He thought they'd established a good friendship. Richards had been involved in a wide range of petty criminal activities, and Jim had encouraged him to maintain his contacts so that he'd have more information to pass on to him. What disturbed him most, though, was what he'd witnessed when he came back from the toilet after his chair collapsed. Through the pub window, he'd seen Nicholls and Jim talking in the car park. There was something about the way their lips were moving, the way their eyes were shifting as they spoke. Richards knew. He just knew they were talking about him. Not just talking about him. He felt convinced they were planning to set him up. Early the next morning, sweating profusely and shivering with fear, Alan Richards walked into the police headquarters in Chelmsford. "I'd like to speak to a senior officer. I have some information about one of your officers who has been involved in numerous criminal activities, and I can prove it." Skimming money off the payouts to his informants and falsifying his records was just the tip of the iceberg. Jim was into much worse than that. He took bribes to lose bits of evidence. He lied to those he worked with, turned a blind eye to serious criminal offences. Jim was playing a dangerous game. He was burning the candle at both ends, and then, for good measure, setting light to the middle as well. He may have been the one with a warrant card, but in the eyes of his informants, he was more of a crook than some of the people he arrested. Of all the people in the whole of Essex that Darren Nicholls could have chosen to confess all to, Detective Constable Jim had to be just about the worst.